I'm joined now by the Editor-at-Large at The Australian, Paul Kelly. Paul, thanks as always. You heard Nick Coatsworth, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. They're cautiously optimistic right now, but they certainly don't want any complacency to be experienced in this country.
Cautious optimism was the word from the end of the week from both Prime Minister Scott Morrison and also the Chief Medical Officer, Brendan Murphy. The point to make here, Kieran, is that the message is very clear. Australia is not going the way of Italy and Spain, despite the warnings several weeks ago from outside medical experts. We had the Prime Minister saying that if earlier trends had continued, the rate of infections in Australia now would have scaled 10,000, whereas the actual numbers are a bit over 5,000. The Health Minister, Greg Hunt, said that these signs were early, they were verifiable, but they were not yet sustainable. The point to make here is that the real message coming from the medical officers, Brendan Murphy and Paul Kelly, all the way through this crisis is whatever the government does must be sustainable. We've got to look at a 6-month period, and that's still the strategy. That strategy is still in place. The other really critical point to make here came from Greg Hunt at the end of the week. Now, his strategy has been to use the containment of the virus in order to build up the health capacity. What he said at the end of the week was that we will have more than 7,500 ventilators. He believes that is sufficient capacity, and that because of the deal between the public hospital sector and the private hospital sector that he put together, we will have sufficient intensive care beds to get us through the crisis. Now, they're big statements, but you can see the extent to which we've built up our health capacity in recent weeks.
The $130 billion wage subsidy support plan put together by Josh Frydenberg and the Prime Minister, we used the word unprecedented, but it certainly was, wasn't it?
This was the turning point, Kieran, in terms of the government's fiscal package, and this will save the livelihoods and save the jobs, literally, of hundreds of thousands of Australians. That's right, the $130 billion package is unprecedented. It received very, very wide support from both unions and business, and I think the critical thing to make about this wage subsidy is the way the economists revised down their levels of unemployment. We saw Westpac revise its unemployment forecast from 17% to 9%, heading towards 7%. We saw Deloitte Access Economic revise its unemployment forecast from 12% to 8%. Now, these are massive changes, and I think the point to make here is that if we can keep the level of unemployment more at the level of a deep recession rather than a depression, that will be a very significant achievement for the country.
It certainly will be. A couple of hiccups, though, in terms of the bipartisanship that we've seen in most of the major announcements. Will this be resolved? Because there's some difference of opinion between the government and Labor on how to put that package in place when Parliament returns this week, albeit briefly.
Well, this is a very significant difference of opinion. I spoke to both the Minister Christian Porter and the Shadow Minister Tony Burke on Friday, and clearly there is a major dispute here over the legislation about how to authorise the $130 billion JobKeeper package. And essentially this goes to the fact that an employer can be eligible for the package, but they are not exempt from their obligations under the Fair Work Act. And of course, there'll be some people, some employees getting the $1,500 who will end up worse off in pay terms or working fewer hours at the direction of the employee. Now, the government solution here is to cut the Gordian knot with a one-size-fits-all amendment that applies across the board in terms of changing the Fair Work Act. Labor says to that, no, we don't want that. That's not necessary. We don't want that change. We want this solved through the Fair Work Commission and changing awards. The government says no, that won't work. So there is a deadlock. It must be resolved because this must be passed through the Parliament this week. The critical question is how it's resolved.
Yeah, indeed. They won't be leaving without some resolution, so we'll watch that closely, Paul. And finally, when we look ahead, whether it is 5, 6, 8 months, what should the recovery look like in your view?
One of the really critical statements that Scott Morrison has made during the entire crisis, Kieran, came at the end of the week when he said the National Cabinet is going to be looking at the recovery phase. In other words, the National Cabinet is going to be taking policy decisions about how we exit from this. So the National Cabinet's going nowhere. Now, this is very bad news for federal Labor. The National Cabinet, the Prime Minister and the Premiers are going to be staying in place, taking further decisions in months to come about the recovery phase. The other really important point the Prime Minister made was that the National Coordination Commission, under the businessman Nev Power, is going to be putting a lot of effort into the recovery phase. Now, that they are going to co-opt the prominent businessman Andrew Liveris to look at opportunities for manufacturing industry, and there will be a lot of opportunities as a result of this crisis. We'll have Greg Combay looking at the IR system and superannuation. I think clearly there will be a social argument in terms of amending awards, but the big point to make here is that after we get through this and we've got this massive debt, Scott Morrison is not going to say, OK, the task now is a new era of austerity to reduce the debt. He won't do that. That would be folly. He's going to be looking at reducing the debt over a long period of time, relying on economic growth. And the other point to make here is, in terms of the politics, we cannot go back to the old politics before the year 2020. What we've got to do is we've got to use this crisis to generate a new spirit of reform in the country. That point is just fundamental.
Absolutely, and out of the crisis, hopefully some growth, not just in an economic sense. Paul, thank you so much. As always, Paul Kelly will talk to you during the week.